when prisoners of war were captured, most of them were marched north into China. 22 American servicemen and 1 British serviceman are turned.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Fünf, zwei, sieben, eins, sechs, neun, acht, drei.
Well, who's our first letter from today, Edward?
An old friend of yours, Doris, Brian Hartley of Thornton-le-Field, asking what's being done to build up Anglo-Soviet relations.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
Welcome to today's episode of Cold War Conversations, where we speak with Dr Grace Huxford, author of The Korean War in Britain, Citizenship, Selfhood and Forgetting. The Korean War was known as the Forgotten War, but it is key in understanding the early Cold War tensions and later repercussions that continue through to today. The equipment used in today's episode was kindly provided by our supporters who make monthly donations via Patreon. A special thanks to all of them. If you would like to support the podcast further and get access to some exclusive extras, go to our website at coldwarconversations.com and click on the Support the Podcast menu option. Now, back to today's episode. The subjects we cover include the social impact within Britain, the UK view of the war, prisoners of war and brainwashing, as well as protests against the war. We met up in a cafe, so excuse some of the background noise, but I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Grace Huxford. Well, Grace, welcome to Cold War Conversations. Really appreciate having you along today. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's really great to talk to Cold War enthusiasts and specialists. So I'm a social historian of modern warfare, I suppose is how I would describe myself. I'm based at the University of Bristol, where I'm a lecturer in British history, and I teach on a variety of subjects relating to war and society, but principally around Britain's Cold War. I also specialise in oral history a bit as well, so yes, teach on a variety of things. But I suppose I would describe myself first and foremost as a social historian of modern warfare.
Okay, thank you for that. And how did you get interested in the Korean War specifically?
So, I suppose much like everybody else, I'm always struck by the news stories that come up particularly around the communist state of North Korea. And these news stories have been generated pretty much since 1953, the unofficial end of the war. So much like a lot of people, I was very interested in the state and in how it regards the wider world. Having said that, though, my training, as I say, I'm a social historian, and I'm interested in how societies respond to war. So even societies, as in the case of Britain, that were 4,000 miles away from where the war took place. So I was interested in how the war impacted back in Britain, not least because 40,000 British servicemen were involved in the war. And I suppose as well I was intrigued by the name, the Forgotten War. How did such a important conflict in Britain's military history become forgotten, and why don't we remember it as much as we remember other modern conflicts? So I was intrigued, I suppose, by that disconnect as well.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the book.
So it's primarily a social and cultural history of the Korean War in Britain, and it's organised around 6 short chapters. The earlier chapters address the very important experiences of the British servicemen who were involved in the war. So that's both regular servicemen, that's National Service conscripts, and also what was known as K-Force volunteers as well. So the earlier chapters look at that military experience. It was a particularly harsh war, Korea, and the experiences that people write about are really important, I think, to address. Having said that, the other chapters of the book take a wide-angle view of the war in Britain, or the impact of the war in Britain. So I have chapters on based on mass observation, the social survey mass observation, which was set up to gauge kind of public opinion and morale, set up in the 1940s but used into the 1950s. So through that I was able to write a chapter on the ordinary experience of the war as well. What did people in London think about the war? And then there's other chapters on protesters and protest against the war, chapters on prisoners of war, and as I say, a chapter on the cultural memory of the war. Why has it been forgotten? Why is it known as the Forgotten War?
Okay, I must admit I did find it interesting, particularly around the protesters and that sort of area. I wasn't necessarily aware of some of that and the significance of how that sort of then followed on into Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and some of the characters there. I did find that interesting. But anyway, we will come on to that. So who would you say is your intended audience for this book? Because it's published by University of Manchester Press.
Yes.
So is it an academic audience or is it a more general audience as well, would you say?
I mean, I hope it would be interesting to both an academic audience and to an audience that's interested in the history of Britain's Cold War and particularly of the early Cold War period. Some of the concepts that I'm exploring are quite in vogue in the academic world as well. So selfhood, for example, a lot of post-war historians writing at the moment are interested in this concept of selfhood, for example.
And you'll have to explain, I think, what does selfhood mean? Because I was intrigued by the sort of subtitle of the book, because you talk about citizen soldiers and selfhood and some of these terms some people might not be familiar with.
Sure. So the three subtitles of the book, yes, are citizenship, selfhood, and forgetting. The first one of citizenship is, in the post-war period, people talk a lot about citizenship. What does it mean to be a good citizen? How do you show that you're a good citizen? Are you active? Are you a passive citizen? This is, in political discussion, but it's also in media discussion. It's something that even the army are interested in. So it's really a buzzword of the 1950s is citizenship. So I wanted to examine what that meant and what that meant to ordinary people as well. What does this concept of being a citizen mean? With selfhood, as I say, post-war historians are very interested in this concept, and it's not always immediately apparent what it means when you first say it. I suppose a simple definition is how people view themselves. And historians are starting to argue that much like the history of technology changes over time, or the history of gender relations changes over time, actually the history of how people regard themselves changes over time. How we view ourselves now is very different from how people viewed themselves in the 16th, 17th century, but even in the 1950s. So I suppose with the book I'm testing that out a bit as well, and it's particularly important when it comes to the history of concepts like brainwashing, which is a term that emerges in the Korean War, because that's all about the self. That's all about somebody believing something and then suddenly believing in something else. So these are terms that people were thinking about in the 1950s, and that I'm trying to use as well. But I also try and tell the story of Britain's Korean War as well. It's not all big concepts.
Yeah, no, and I would echo that. I did find the book really made me think, because there were some aspects there that I hadn't thought about in terms of not just the Korean War, but conflict generally, and serving in the army as well. It was very thought-provoking, I think, is what I'm trying to say in a very roundabout sort of way. So the sources you use for the book, you mentioned mass observation, which some people who are familiar with World War II history will be aware of. But what other sources did you get access to?
So I used a deliberately wide-angle, a wide-angle lens on my sources as well. So I looked at contemporary newspaper coverage of the war. I looked at government records around the war as well, particularly on things like prisoners of war. I also was able to use material relating to war protest. So, for example, I went to the University of Kent, which holds the archival material of someone called the Red Dean of Canterbury, Hewlett Johnson, who was a famous war protester. Actually, he was very well known at this time, and later becomes involved in the campaign for nuclear disarmament as well. So I was able to look at letters and press coverage around some of these quite charismatic figures that emerged during the Korean War as well. So a really wide range, as well as, of course, material relating to the soldiers' experiences. So letters, diaries, oral history interviews that were recorded with senior officers in the 1980s and 1990s. I used those as well.
Yeah, no, again, I mean, the whole protest element, I mean, I was fascinated by the story of Monica Felton and this seemingly innocuous town planner who suddenly becomes involved following a trip out with a local Labour Party, I think, to Korea. So recommend it for that. I'm not going to tell too much of the story there because I want people to, buy the book as well. But some great real gems there that probably wouldn't have come out of a general reading of the Korean War. So if we look at the book itself, I mean, I just want a few insights for people thinking of purchasing the book. So, I mean, one of the areas you cover is how people react to the Korean War, because it was effectively quite close to World War II. I remember my father, who served in World War II, saying that he almost was called up for Korea. So how did the general UK population react to the outbreak of war and the circumstances?
So, yes, as you say, the Korean War comes just 5 years after the end of the Second World War, and in the book I try to emphasize how that aftermath of war doesn't just stop in 1945. Britain is still dealing with the aftermath of war, economically, politically, socially, and individuals as well. So in every chapter of the book we come up against the memory of the Second World War. So for soldiers, for national servicemen serving in Korea, for example, probably too young to have served in the Second World War, they are still aware, they're very aware of what their fathers, their brothers, their uncles did in the Second World War. So it's always there. And by contrast, the Korean War is much more complicated. As I say, it's 4,000 miles away. Britain has fewer historic connections with Korea as well. There was an amazing series of talks that a Korean academic did in Britain in 1950. And the questions that she got, she wrote a book about it afterwards called Korea Through British Eyes. And the questions that people asked just went to show how little people knew about Korea, but also that they wanted to know more. There was a real interest. Much like today, I suppose, when when Korea's in the news, people are really keen to know more about the history. So she talks a lot about that. And I suppose in the book as well, it's a tricky question for Cold War historians, for all Cold War historians, I think, to gauge how genuine the fear was about it escalating into a global conflict or it affecting people back in Britain. So it's something that we really have to think about, I think, as Cold War historians, because at the start of the Korean War, there is a sense of panic. Probably doesn't last beyond the first few weeks, but in the mass observation surveys, for example, people talk about mass mobilization. They worry about people being called up again. Some people even mention having to redig their shelters and their gardens. And it's, certainly for those first few weeks, there is a worry about the war and whether it will escalate into another global conflict. Having said that, by 1953, I think one newspaper columnist said that the English victory in the Ashes cricket tournament in 1953 occasioned much more celebration than the end of the war in Korea, and that it eclipsed the end of the war in Korea as well. So what happens in those 3 years? You go from this initial panic to, a relatively quiet ending to the war.
Yeah. And I was interested, it was under the aegis of the United Nations, and there was a lot of hope from people after the end of World War II that United Nations was going to be a force for good. I just wonder what impact that had about people's feelings about the war, that it was a good cause, or I guess it's a difficult one because there was still a lot of left-wingers in the UK. The Communist Party was not a big force, but was more significant than it is nowadays. And I've probably thrown in about 3 different questions there, actually.
So I suppose on the UN, both the Labour government that was in power at the outbreak of the war, and Winston Churchill's Conservative government that comes into power in 1951, both of those governments express the wish to support the collective ideals of the UN. And Britain actually is able to... There's a historian called Robert Barnes who's written a lot about Britain's relationship with the UN during the Korean War. And his work's very interesting. It's very interesting, actually, in showing how Britain's able to actually display quite a lot of influence at the UN, particularly over its American partners, but that it's a collaborative international effort. The Korean War involves 21 nations are under the auspices of the UN, doing different things. Some are military, having a military role. Others are more humanitarian support. But it is a very international war.
Okay. No, thank you for that. You talk about the concept of the citizen soldier and national service. Now, I get that when we talked about selfhood and citizenship, because obviously Attlee's government came to power, massive majority end of World War II, welfare state was built. Well, it was a socialist government. You talk about citizen soldier and national service. Is that one and the same, or 2 different areas?
It's a very good question, and I think something that people at the time were trying to grapple with as well. On the surface of things, and you see this in Army Educational Corps discussions around this time, there was a hope that national servicemen could be some type of citizen soldier. There's a lot of discussion about how a soldier needs to know why he's involved in a war in order to perform well in it. And at the end of the Second World War, leading into this period, there are lots of initiatives set up to encourage that. So the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, for example, these are local discussion groups in Army units about current affairs. So there is this interest. However, there's a great book by Richard Vinan called National Service, and in it he says that the Korean War was the national service war. And actually, when you look at their experiences, whether they felt like citizen soldiers, defending democracy, I think is another matter. Some talk about it. Some talk about it tongue in cheek. Others don't talk about it at all. So I think it's another instance where there's potentially a bit of a disconnect between some of the rhetoric around national service and how people actually on the ground feel about it. Yeah.
Because the Malayan emergency was going on at the same time, and again, that's probably an even more forgotten
Absolutely,
war potentially.
yeah.
Perhaps that's the subject for another book of yours. I don't know, but I think it, and that was again national servicemen being involved in that. But I think it's interesting because there's a whole raft of conflicts going on around this period. I mean, if you include Palestine and the British Mandate, there's a lot going on that people don't sort of recognise as Cold War, but there certainly are the early starts of the Cold War. Perhaps Palestine not, but certainly Malayan emergency against the communist insurgency and Korea is the early stages of the Cold War.
Absolutely. And I think there's another great book by Martin Thomas called Fight or Flight, where he talks about how the Cold War is kind of bound up with decolonization as well. This is a really sort of tempestuous period of history, and one I think that has been overlooked. And particularly, from the service personnel perspective, these are really harsh wars as well. And reading, the letters, the diaries, you see that. So I think, and they're harsh wars as well for the populations, the local populations. Korea in particular, there's one estimate that the North lost about 11% of its population during the war, and there are various other estimates as well. They are particularly harsh wars, and I think, albeit short ones, they are, these small wars are really significant, I think, to both the Cold War and decolonization.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Now, one of the areas you talk about is British prisoners of war during the Korean War. Now, I believe there was just over 1,000 taken prisoner, and that sort of brings in what you mentioned earlier around brainwashing, which I was quite intrigued about because it becomes quite a common theme in popular culture at the time, with films like Manchurian Candidate and Ipcress File, I think is another one that you mentioned. And you see, I've read the book. I have done a bit of homework.
You have.
So can we start off with the brainwashing aspect?
So brainwashing as a term, it has a Chinese equivalent, which was prevalent before the Korean War. However, it's first used by an American journalist in 1950. There's doubts as to whether he was funded by the CIA, this particular journalist, but he uses it to describe the sudden adherence to a completely new system of belief, essentially. So he first uses it in 1950, but it becomes used in 1951, 1952 to describe what's happening in Korea to prisoners of war. Because when prisoners of war were captured, most of them were marched north into China, around the banks of the Yalu River, and to varying degrees, they were subjected to what were called political re-education classes. And these were... There's some amazing material that the National Army Museum holds on these classes, and they were political classes, historical classes about world history, essentially, but very much through the Chinese communist lens. So, talking about American imperialism, and there's some amazing material that comes from those classes, and 22 American servicemen and 1 British serviceman are turned, so to speak, during these classes. Now,
I presume you're not including George Blake in that, but we'll come on to him.
We'll come on to him. He's a slightly different character in that he's not a service personnel, but he is also allegedly turned during the Korean War. Whether they are or not, whether they have longer standing grievances is something we can talk about.
Yeah, we could spend another hour probably talking about that.
Yeah. But this term brainwashing becomes very popular to describe this sudden change of belief system, particularly, as you say, after the war. And it really takes off in the 1960s. We see, as you say, the Ipcress file. We see a whole host of films and novels that use this term brainwashing. And people still use it today, the term brainwashing. I think not realizing that it is itself a Cold War term created during the Cold War. And some historians have said it's a bit of a lazy shorthand to describe this sudden change of viewpoint. But it's got a fascinating cultural history, the term itself.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you mentioned about what I described in my notes as the stay-behinds, and one solitary Royal Marine, Andrew Condren, is the only one that stays behind. But then he returns back to the UK, I think, in the early 60s. Can you just give me a little bit more about his story?
So, as a historian called Paul Mackenzie, who's written about Condren in great detail as well, he's an interesting character. He did an interview, actually, that's freely available through the Imperial War Museum online archive. So your listeners might find it interesting to listen to that themselves.
I'll make sure we put a link up to that in the show notes.
It's it's a really interesting story, and he describes it. He says he was intrigued. He was interested in knowing what was happening in communist China. And so at the end of the war, he decides to stay. And there's various notes in the National Archives about this. It causes alarm, but as I say, he's only one serviceman. He comes back to the UK in the 1960s. He's becoming more disaffected with China, and various family circumstances mean that he wants to come back to the UK. And there's lots of discussion about whether he should be court-martialed, whether he should be tried for treason, all of these sorts of things. He's not in the end, but he is interviewed by military authorities when he comes back. And in the oral history interview with the Imperial War Museum, he talks about that. So yes, and I believe he wrote about his experiences as well. So quite an individual sort of character as well, but a very interesting story too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I think there's a worry. You mentioned in your book a worry about a British officer who sort of doesn't. He returns back, but doesn't really get some of the promotion that he probably would have done, because there's some almost suspicion about whether he's been turned as well, particularly after the revelation of Blake.
Absolutely. So George Blake, an intelligence officer working in Asia, is found out to have been a double agent for the Soviets after the Korean War. He's imprisoned during the Korean War, and often people see this as the moment where he became interested in communist ideas and started to become a double agent. He's a fascinating person as well, and has written an autobiography about his experiences and his motivations. But in the British intelligence community, but also within the government as well, there's worry about how somebody like Blake was able to access this material and to go undetected. So part of a wider history, as we know, of double agents in the Cold War.
A subject very close to our heart on Cold War conversations,
absolutely,
I must say.
Yeah. So after Blake is discovered, and he later has a dramatic escape from Wormwood Scrubs prison, which is very interesting to read about, there's a recommendation called the Radcliffe Recommendation that the government bring in, which stipulates that somebody who's been held captive, I can't remember the exact period of time, but if you'd been held captive for a series of months in a communist setting, you had to have various extra sort of vetting procedures brought in. And yes, as you say, some people felt that held them back in terms of promotion. Not in terms of the numbers, there weren't that many people that were affected by this by the later 1960s. But yes, it's certainly part of the aftermath of the war is this worry about. I don't think they would have used the term brainwashing, because it, by the 1960s, became quite a sort of cultural buzzword in the end. But they were worried about this change.
You talk in your research about certainly the British soldiers believing that the US soldiers are not able to deal with hardship as much because they've not lived through, bombing of the homeland and austerity and rationing, and that they're almost more susceptible to luxuries and things like that to try and induce them to not necessarily provide information. But I'm not describing this very well, but you know where I'm going.
I know what you mean. The British servicemen at the time talk about something called give-up-itis, which is used to describe your sort of fortitude and your ability to withstand the privations of captivity. So they talk about, and they say that a lot of the younger American servicemen have not lived through post-war austerity. They've not lived through wartime rationing. Many of them have been living rather nice lives in post-war Japan. And there's certainly a belief among the British servicemen that they're somehow less hardy. Of course, a wild generalisation, and of course, not all British personnel felt that way about their American counterparts. But there is an interesting sort of sub-story here about, I suppose, what the special relationship looked like on the ground, and how the troops in this very international war regarded one another. There was great admiration, for example, of the Turkish prisoners of war, because they were seen as somehow more hardy. So it's an interesting element of the story, I think.
And you forget those other that, okay, it's a forgotten war, but when you start looking at it, you automatically look at it through the prism of a UK and probably US side of things, and you forget that there was Turkey involved and other countries of which I can't currently remember.
A great deal. Ethiopia, Thailand, the Philippines, some countries that are keen to be involved in the UN mission, but have differing amounts of involvement.
I think one of the things that I did find interesting was you mentioned the TV program MASH and how that is set in the Korean War. But if you ask people, probably, and this is not a scientific number, but I would say 95% of them would probably say Vietnam War and not realise it was Korean War.
Absolutely. There's a book by Charles Young about prisoners of war, actually, in America. And he talks about how, particularly in the American context, Korea kind of falls between two stools, really. It's not as sort of morally unimpeachable as the Second World War. It's not a good war in that way. But it's not as bad a war as Vietnam, where people are burning their draft cards and things like that. So it kind of falls between these, it's not vilified and it's not praised. And as a result, that potentially led to it being forgotten.
Yeah. Well, you've given me a great segue into my next question, which
Excellent.
is where I want to talk about the opposition in the UK to the war. Because as you say, okay, Vietnam, there wasn't any direct British involvement, but there was a lot of protest in the UK. You've obviously got CND in the 60s around the Aldermaston marches and the protests against nuclear weapons. But how much opposition was there in the UK to Korea?
So the opposition to Korea was, I should say, quite small scale. And it was often done by quite charismatic individuals or small groups working together. So there's various British-Chinese friendship groups that are opposed to the war, various peace groups as well. So the historian E.P. Thompson is involved in a peace group in Yorkshire. He writes a letter expressing discontent at the way the war is being handled and calling to stop it. Some of these organisations are, they're under the peace umbrella, and many of them later become sort of influenced by the Soviet Union. So they're not all sort of independent protesters. Having said that, there are some protesters who are motivated individually to oppose the war. So I mentioned the Red Dean of Canterbury. often going against, the culture in the wider Church of England. He is really campaigning against the war. He writes letters. He's vilified in the newspapers. He's since the 1930s was very interested in the Soviet Union and made trips there, and was again probably leaning towards sort of that sort of level of influence, but again a very principled man as well, opposing the war for reasons that he felt were important. So there are these individuals, and you mentioned Monica Felton. As you say, there's more about it in the book, but she's a town planner in Stevenage, and yet makes a trip to North Korea and becomes this. The press call her, that woman Felton, and they really criticize her, and there's calls for her to be, tried for treason. The punishment of which at the time was hanging. These figures are hugely divisive, but very interesting from a historian's perspective. And yes, the opposition is small scale to the war, but it's kind of a forerunner to the other protest movements that you mentioned. So Hewlett-Johnson, the Red Dean, becomes involved in the campaign for nuclear disarmament, as does E.P. Thompson. And, it's kind of a forerunner to those slightly more coherent peace movements and opposition movements later in the Cold War.
And what was the position of the Communist Party of Great Britain over the war? I presume they were in opposition.
Yes, and as various bits in the book, I have a section on British communists and the Korean War. I think there's a tendency to maybe exaggerate the number of British communists. They were not, a very big organisation. However, they were quite prolific in the amount of material that they produced. I mean, the People's History Museum here in Manchester has the Labour Party archive, but it also has the Communist Party archive. And there's some very interesting material that the Communist Party produced, quite strongly worded, some of it, about the sort of, particularly about real strong anti-Americanism in some of their material. And they oppose the war for slightly different reasons to humanitarians who are sort of highlighting how harsh this war is, the toll that it's taking on the Korean population. But it's still, interesting as well.
The war ends, but it's almost immediately forgotten, or is that me just really paraphrasing?
I think you're right. It is the example that I used about the Ashes cricket tournament occasioning more celebration. There's also the UN flag is raised in Bury St Edmunds, and the people in the town of Bury St Edmunds are slightly bemused by this and wonder why it's there. So it is partially forgotten. I would say as well that there are pockets of remembrance. So, for example, when the Gloucestershire Regiment returned to Southampton, British Pathé are there. They are filming them, and they're trying to find out what it was like for the prisoners of war. There are also local monuments that go up, largely driven by local veterans organisations. So there is some remembrance, but it's nothing compared to the World Wars. And there's a sense of, particularly among the veterans, they describe themselves as forgotten veterans. So there is a sense that one of the veterans says that, there's no Sebastian Faulks, there's no Louis de Bernier. These novelists who write about modern war, none of them write about Korea. So whilst there is local remembrance, and in 2014 there was a new national monument open to the Korean War on Victoria Embankment in London, certainly in the intervening years there was less than for the World Wars, for the reasons we've discussed.
And so were any of the casualties from Korea recorded on local war memorials, or were they even forgotten then?
Yes, so in a town where I used to live, Leamington Spa, there was a panel added with a few people on there. I would say it's not It's not in all war memorials, certainly. But some towns and cities who were involved in these small wars, you do see addendum being added to war memorials. And the National Arboretum has a Korean War memorial as well. So in some places, yes, these other wars are added.
One thing I did want to ask you about was, because while I was doing the research for this, I found something about the 1952 Intercamp Olympics, which I think was a piece of research you've done. Can you just tell me a bit about that?
So that was very interesting, again, to read about. So in 1952, the Olympics were being held in Helsinki, I believe, and thousands of British and other, 1,000 British prisoners of war and thousands of other nationalities of prisoners of war were being held in these camps along the Yalu River in China. And as part of a propaganda exercise, the Chinese decide that they're going to hold their own Olympics using all these nationalities of prisoners of war. They don't necessarily pit nationalities against one another. Some of it is you're representing your camp, so there's a number system of camps. But it's this great propaganda exercise. British prisoners of war are involved. British prisoner of war who's involved in the sprint relay, and they produce this amazing brochure that comes with it, the prisoner of war Olympics. It seems to have been quite a fun day for those involved, but very much a propaganda exercise as well. And to show that they were treating the prisoners of war well. Not all prisoners of war would have agreed that they were treated well. But yes, it's a fascinating episode in propaganda.
It sort of reminded me of that film Escape to Victory, which is not Korean War, but is sort of a bit like that. Of your research that you did for the book, what would you say was the most surprising thing that came, something where you thought, wow, I really didn't expect that or know that?
I didn't know until I started delving deeper into the cultural history of the war after the war, that Basil Fawlty of Fawlty Towers was supposed to have been a Korean War veteran. And he says to his wife, Sybil, at one point, I'm dangerous, I killed 4 men in Korea. And she just says to a passing guest, he was in the catering corps, he used to poison them. So I didn't know that, and I found that really interesting.
I'll have to try and find that clip.
It's a good one, yeah.
It's got to be on YouTube somewhere. I understand that we have a special Cold War conversation exclusive deal on your book where we have a discount. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So until, I think it's the 16th of November, podcast listeners to this podcast can get a 50% discount on the book. So if you go to the...
That's 50.
50.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a great deal we've got there for you listeners.
Absolutely. So, and thanks to Manchester University Press who've arranged this. And if you go to their website, you'll find a catalogue of all their books, and you'll find my book there. And yes, simply enter, when you get to the till section, enter into the discount in capital letters, podcast. And then Cold War Conversation podcast listeners can get their discount there.
Fantastic. We will post a link to that on the show notes. So don't worry if you didn't catch all of that, but just go to the show notes and get your 50% discount there. So, completed this book. What's next for you?
So I've just started an oral history project. So that's where I, much like yourself, go around and interview people who've been involved in Cold War history. My particular interest is the British Army of the Rhine. So, this military force that was posted in West Germany, and is still there. It's still there at the moment until 2020. British Forces Germany has various bases in the northwest area, So my project is a social history, again, of British forces in Germany. So I'm looking to interview people who were service personnel serving there, but also their families, people who grew up there as children, support workers, all sorts of people that, teachers, chaplains, that end up in these amazing communities, and really communities that, as I say, the bases are closing in 2020. So this is the end chapter of that history, which again is another taken for granted element of Cold War British history, I think.
Sounds like we're going to have you on again.
Absolutely.
Oh no, that'd be great. Sounds like a really interesting subject, and certainly something that our listeners will be interested in. Are there any museums that you would recommend that people visit to better understand the Korean War?
I think I'd recommend 2 museums. So the National Army Museum in Chelsea in London is an excellent museum, recently undergone a massive refurbishment. And some very different permanent galleries there. But they have a very strong Korean War collection there. And I used their Templar Study Centre, which is in the basement of the museum, to access a lot of my material. And that's publicly accessible as well. You have to bring in various documents and sign up for a visitor card. But much like the British Library in London, if you're interested and you want to look at some of these primary sources yourself, you can do so. And the other one is the Soldiers of Gloucester Museum in Gloucester. And that's particularly interesting because the Gloucestershire Regiment, the Glorious Gloucesters, are perhaps one of the most well-known elements of the war. Their famous sort of last stand at Imjin. And the museum has a lot of material, both military and some of the more personal individual sides of things. So there's a copy of Colonel Khan, who was the most senior British officer to be taken captive during the war. He was kept in solitary confinement for a lot of his time in captivity, which I imagine, I don't think I could withstand that sort of solitary confinement. I think it's certainly... and he never really spoke about it after the war. However, he did carve a Celtic cross whilst he was there. And that's now in Gloucester Cathedral. But the Soldiers of Gloucester Museum have a copy of it and, a segment about it. So there's some really interesting material that they hold as well.
If you were a filmmaker and you had the budget, what real-life Cold War incident would you recreate on film and why?
So I really enjoyed this question, and it took a lot of thinking about, and there were a number of things that I could have picked. One of which, so my new project, as I say, is looking at the British Army of the Rhine, and they're involved in some massive military exercises, as are other NATO troops. So there's one, Able Archer in 1983. However, Deutschland 83, the TV program, beat me to it on that one, and they recreated Able Archer in quite a good way.
Well, you should check out my Able Archer episode.
I will.
It's one of the most popular episodes, that one.
Excellent. So. Oh, I'll definitely check that
one out.
Anyway,
I interrupted you while you were in your flow there.
Well, I would probably then say, as Able Archer has been covered, there are other exercises as well. So, in 1984, the following year, BOR involved in Exercise Lionheart, and there are also other more everyday exercises. So, in the British Zone, but also in Berlin, things. Exercises like Active Edge and Rocking Horse are called periodically to prepare troops for an invasion from Warsaw Pact countries. So I'd probably recreate one of those because my oral history participants have talked about them, and they seem to have often come in the middle of the night. I'd like to know more about that through film.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've always thought a sort of drama based around a possible Warsaw Pact invasion of Europe would be an interesting subject to cover. But then nobody asked me what Cold War film I want to film.
Has nobody asked you?
Well, no, I have to get somebody to interview me. That'll be it. So you're making your film about the Cold War. What piece of music would you have as the soundtrack?
Again, this there were a number of songs that I could have picked for this, but there's a great album by an American band called The National, and they have a song called Start a War, which is got a great line, walk away now or you're going to start a war, and it's a really good song anyway, so I'd probably have that as the background. It's a good song.
Oh, I've not heard of that. I'll be trawling YouTube for that. We'll add that to the show note links. If you could invite 3 personalities from the Cold War period to have a few drinks with, who would they be and what questions would you ask them?
So I'd probably have to have Dr. Monica Felton, because she's a real character in my book, and hugely divisive, and I'd just want to know what it was like, living through all that criticism, going to North Korea. Why did she go to North Korea? So I definitely want to interview her. Probably as well, Colonel Khan, who was imprisoned, famously reticent man, but as I've said, extraordinary as well. So I think I'd want to know more about his experiences if he'd talk to me about them.
Well, we're assuming that they will talk to you.
Yeah.
Here,
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I've recently been to Prague, and so much Cold War history in Prague. But probably somebody like Václav Havel or someone. I found that really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, great. Well, that's a great set there. We've not had that set before,
okay.
So like that one. Are there any books in English that you would particularly recommend for anyone interested in the Korean War? Obviously, the 50% exclusive Cold War conversation discounted Korean War in Britain would be top of the list, but what else would you recommend? There's
some excellent military histories out there if your listeners are interested in learning more about that. So the official history, 2 volumes for the real enthusiasts, was written by a former prisoner of war, General Sir Anthony Farrar Hockley. And that's available through a lot of central libraries and university libraries. There's also some shorter summaries by Peter Lowe and Callum MacDonald, some shorter military histories and political histories. There's also some excellent books if you're interested around prisoners of war. There's an excellent book by S.P. Mackenzie on British prisoners of war. But there's also the book I mentioned by Charles Young called, I think it's called Name, Rank and Number, about American prisoners of war. And the other book I mentioned about the UN by Robert Barnes. So, and I think there's also a very popular history as well by Max Hastings as well. So, a number of avenues for your readers to explore.
Yeah, there's a surprising number out
for
there.
A forgotten war, yeah.
Yeah. Of your, I'm assuming that you have a library at home of books. What would you say is your most prized book that you have?
So I have a book that was produced by the Chinese People's Volunteers, so the guards essentially guarding British and other UN prisoners of war in Korea, and it's ostensibly a propaganda book, but it's called Thinking Soldiers, and in it prisoners of war, including Andrew Condren, who opted to stay in China after the end of the war, talk about their experiences of prisoners of war, and whilst, as I say, it is largely a propaganda piece, there aren't many copies of it, and it's a real precious item that I have.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I keep it very safe. Yeah. I
don't know whether you could share a photo of a page of it or something. That would be. I'd just be really interesting to see what it looks like.
There might be more copies out there than I've uncovered, but this is your listeners might be able to track some down. But yeah,
great. Well, thank you for that. Film or TV series that would be a good factual or fictional representation of the Korean War.
There's MASH, of course, that you mentioned, and some of my friends have mentioned. I don't watch it, but Mad Men. I think Don Draper is a Korean War veteran, apparently.
Wow, didn't know that.
Yeah. But for me, I think there's a film that comes out just after the war called A Hill in Korea, and it's based on a novel of the same name, and it's about a national service patrol that goes wrong. Talking to veterans, it doesn't seem to have been the most accurate of films, and it's very sensational. But interestingly, it's Michael Caine's first film, out of national service in Korea himself. And so he's got some interesting bits in his autobiography where he talks about this being his first film and his experiences with that. So I'd recommend it, even though it's perhaps not the most accurate representation. It's a piece of history itself.
Well, I think we do have a number of Michael Caine fans who listen to the podcast. So you're on Twitter, aren't you?
I am, yep, Grace_Huxford, and I have a University of Bristol research page as well, so if anyone wants to know more about my forthcoming research or research that I've done before, just have a look at, if you Google me, my page will come up.
Well, Grace, thank you so much for making time to talk to us. That's been really interesting, and I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to your listeners for tuning in as well.
Well, that's all we had time for, but don't miss our exclusive Cold War Conversations offer on Grace's book. Just search for the Manchester University Press website and quote the discount code podcast and you will get 50% off until the 16th of November. There's a link to the Manchester University Press website in our show notes, which are at coldwarconversations.com. Just click on the episodes and show notes option on the homepage. If you like what you are listening to, do join our Facebook discussion group where there's loads of extra Cold War information and further discussions with our guests, academics, military veterans and other interested people. Just search for Cold War Conversations. We're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod. Lastly, if you like what you are hearing, do leave reviews with your podcast provider. Thank you very much for listening and supporting the podcast. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.
This is the Voice of America, Washington, D.C., signing off.